Somewhere along a front line that runs roughly 1,000 kilometers through Eastern Europe, soldiers are digging into the same kind of ditch that swallowed a generation more than 100 years ago. Trenches, artillery duels, weeks spent fighting over a few hundred meters of dirt. According to Euromaidan Press, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has now lasted 1,568 days, almost exactly the same length as the First World War. Nobody planned that number. It just showed up on a calendar, and it raises an odd question. How does a war fought with drones and satellites end up looking so much like one fought with rifles and horses? We're not here to tell you the two wars are the same. They aren't. Not in scale, not in technology, not in the number of lives lost. But we do want to walk through why two conflicts, separated by more than a century and fought by completely different armies, ended up running almost exactly as long. By the end, you'll understand something most coverage skips over. Why long, grinding wars keep happening, even when everyone insists this time will be different. The numbers are the whole reason this comparison exists. Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. World War I began on July 28, 1914, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and ended with the armistice on November 11, 1918. Count the days in each conflict and, according to Euromaidan Press's calculation, they land on the same figure, 1,568. It's the kind of coincidence that only shows up if someone is keeping close track. Someone was. I spent a while looking into how researchers actually track a war's duration day by day, and one detail kept nagging me. There's no single, official clock for either war. Historians still argue about when World War I really ended, whether that's the armistice in November 1918 or the Treaty of Versailles that formally closed things out in mid-1919. Depending on which endpoint you use, the comparison shifts by months. Euromaidan Press used the armistice date, the most commonly cited endpoint, and that's reportedly what produced the 568-day match with the war in Ukraine. Counting days is the easy part. Verifying what has actually happened on the ground over more than 4 years of fighting is a different problem entirely. Frontline positions shift by the week, sometimes by the day, and both governments have strong incentives to describe the map favorably. So when anyone talks about where the front line is in this war, they're describing a reported, best available picture, not a confirmed fact. That fog of war problem isn't new. It's the same one historians ran into when they first tried to reconstruct the Western Front more than a century ago. Official communiques from 1914 to 1918 routinely understated losses and exaggerated ground gained on every side of that war. It took decades of archival work, regimental diaries, and cross-checked casualty records after the war ended before historians could piece together a reasonably reliable picture of what actually happened week to week. Today's open-source researchers have a faster toolkit: satellite passes, geolocated phone footage, drone video posted online. But the underlying challenge is identical. Wartime information is contested by design, and confidence has to be built patiently, source by source, rather than assumed. The comparison gets more interesting than a shared number. Both wars ended up defined by the same military condition: a war of attrition. In 1914, European armies expected a fast, decisive war. Soldiers on multiple sides were told they'd be home by Christmas. Instead, within months, opposing armies had dug hundreds of miles of trenches running from the North Sea coast to the Swiss border, and the war settled into a stalemate that repeated infantry assaults and artillery bombardments couldn't break for years. Historians point to battles like Verdun and the Somme in 1916 as the moments when attrition, deliberately wearing down the other side's manpower and resources, became the explicit strategy rather than a fallback. In Ukraine, something structurally similar unfolded on a much faster timeline. Russia's initial campaign reportedly aimed for a rapid takeover of Kyiv within days. Instead, after Ukrainian forces held the capital in the war's first weeks and Russian troops withdrew from northern Ukraine that April, the conflict shifted into a slower, grinding fight, particularly in the east and south, where trench networks, minefields, and sustained artillery exchanges have defined years of combat around places like Bakhmut and Avdiivka. Both battles reportedly took months to resolve, measured in city blocks rather than miles, echoing the scale of ground fought over, if not the tactics, of the Western Front generations earlier. That's the part most people don't expect. On paper, a war fought with precision-guided weapons, drones, and real-time satellite intelligence should look nothing like one fought with rifles and cavalry reconnaissance. And yet the underlying pattern, dig in, hold ground, wear the other side down, reappeared almost unchanged. Military analysts have pointed to this parallel repeatedly. Widespread drone reconnaissance has made it harder for either side to mass troops for a breakthrough without being spotted first, which, ironically, pushes both armies back toward defensive, entrenched positions, the same dynamic that machine guns and observation balloons created along the Western Front in 1914. So the front lines rhyme. The underlying military logic rhymes. But that's exactly where the easy comparison should stop, because underneath it, these are two enormously different wars, and treating them as equivalent would flatten a lot of context that actually matters. Start with scale. World War I is estimated to have produced tens of millions of dead, wounded, and missing once every nation involved is counted across multiple fronts spanning Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, and it eventually drew in dozens of countries and colonial territories. The war in Ukraine, by contrast, is a bilateral conflict between two states fought mostly along a single, defined front line. Casualty figures for both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries remain disputed and aren't independently confirmed by neutral sources. Both governments have obvious incentives to shape those numbers, and outside estimates vary widely depending on methodology. We're not going to hand you a figure here because no one outside the militaries directly involved actually has one they can verify. Technology is the other place the comparison breaks down fast, and it's worth pausing on because it's also the reason the war looks the way it does today. World War I introduced tanks, poison gas, and machine guns as new, largely untested tools of industrial-scale killing. Commanders on all sides spent years learning, at enormous human cost, how to actually use them. The war in Ukraine is being fought with a toolkit from a completely different century. Small first-person view drones used for both reconnaissance and precision strikes, satellite-based intelligence sharing, longer-range precision artillery, and electronic warfare systems aimed at jamming enemy drones and communications. Multiple defense outlets have described it as one of the most heavily surveilled battlefields in history, a front line where it's become extremely difficult for either side to move armored vehicles or infantry in the open without being spotted from the air within minutes. And that's the question this whole comparison is pointing toward. If modern militaries have all this technology, the sensors, the precision weapons, the real-time intelligence, why does a major war still end up looking like 1914? Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. A lot of pre-2022 military analysis badly underestimated how easily a modern, technologically advanced war could still slide into a long, grinding stalemate. For years, defense commentators talked about fast, decisive campaigns enabled by precision weapons and air power as the new normal. The war in Ukraine has been a hard correction to that assumption. Once both sides had enough drones, artillery, and layered defenses to blunt each other's advances, the war stopped moving quickly, and large stretches of the front have been measured in meters, not miles, for months at a time. What strikes us most about this case isn't the coincidence of the day count. It's what that coincidence reveals about how wars actually end or fail to. A war doesn't grind on for 4+ years because one side is simply stubborn. It grinds on because neither side has found, or been forced into, a decisive advantage, and because both sides keep believing that one more offensive, one more winter, one more shipment of weapons might change that calculation. That was true in the trenches of northern France in 1916. According to extensive reporting on the war in Ukraine, a similar dynamic appears to be holding along its front line too. Do you think modern military technology has actually made fast, decisive wars more likely? Or did this war just prove that grinding stalemates are still the default once neither side can force a clean breakthrough? It's a genuinely open question, and people who follow this war closely disagree. There's one more detail that stuck with us while putting this together. In 1918, the war that had seemed endless ended in a matter of weeks, once one side's ability to keep fighting simply collapsed. Germany's army and economy buckled under years of losses and an Allied naval blockade, and the armistice followed quickly once that collapse became undeniable. It's a reminder that a war of attrition doesn't necessarily mean a war without an end. It usually means the end arrives suddenly, once exhaustion crosses a threshold that's very hard to see coming from the outside. Whether or when that applies to the war in Ukraine is exactly the kind of question serious analysts are reportedly reluctant to predict with any confidence, and we won't pretend to know either. What we can say, based on the reporting so far, is that as of the most recent available assessments, the front line in the east has remained largely static compared with the more dramatic territorial shifts seen earlier in the war. Put yourself in the position of an analyst trying to explain this war honestly, without hedging into vague both sides language and without overselling a headline. That tension between staying accurate and still saying something useful is a real constraint on how this story gets covered, and it's part of why so much reporting on this war leans on careful, attributed language instead of bold predictions. So where does that leave the 568-day comparison? As a marker, not a prophecy. It tells us this war has now run as long as a conflict that redrew the map of Europe, and that alone is worth sitting with. It doesn't tell us how or when this one ends. Every attritional war in history looked unbreakable right up until the moment it wasn't, and there's no reliable formula for guessing which side runs out of road first. There's a lot more we couldn't fit into this video, particularly how industrial capacity and supply lines, not just battlefield tactics, ultimately decided the outcome of World War I, and how that same question of who can keep supplying their military longer is shaping this war right now. If you want that deeper dive, comment more and we'll put one together. For now, if you want to follow this story through primary sources instead of secondhand takes, the reporting we used to build this video is listed below. Wars like this one are usually understood clearly only in hindsight. This is what it looks like while it's still being written.